I'm seeing quite a few of you here already, which is great. Nice to see everybody. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes before we get started, but I'm seeing about 18 of you now, which is great. We'll give everybody just a couple more minutes to join the call before we jump into the webinar today. Maybe if you're feeling active on the chat and you're an outspoken developer, maybe you could add in the chat where you are located, what country you're in. Might be nice to see what parts of the world you're all in before we get started. Maybe not. I'm not sure actually if I see the chat on my side, but I'm sure Estefania will let me know. Just give it a minute or two more. We've got someone from the Netherlands. Hi, Diana. Great to have you here with us. Okay, it seems that the chat is maybe disabled, so we can work on that, but maybe that's why it's so quiet out there. All good. All right, well, I think we're doing pretty well. I think we can probably get started on today's webinar on remaining agile with your medical device development. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, the team here at Matrix Requirements. As a bit of an introduction, I'm Adam Newman. I look after marketing here at Matrix. So I do everything related to helping elevate the word around how medical device companies can become more compliant, leveraging solutions such as ours. So both our ALM solution and our QMS. We're specifically in the medical device industry. So this is really our space and our safe space. So if at the end of this webinar you're looking at solutions or you'd like to have a discussion with us, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or any members of the team, and we'd be happy to explore this with you further. But that's not the topic for today. So the topic is really looking at how can you remain agile with your medical device development. And we're going to touch on this topic in 4 different ways today. We're going to look at agile within the medical devices industry itself, how you and your business can implement an agile methodology, what tools and things that your team may already be using. If you're a team of devs, maybe you've already got them in place, but Tillman will also have some suggestions on his side. And then we're also going to look into sort of our future prospects for Agile and where it's going in the future. So before we continue on, maybe it's a good time I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and it's just going to be the video of myself and Tillman. And maybe Tillman, you could give us an introduction to yourself, a little bit about who you are, your role here at Matrix Requirements.
Sure. Thank you, Adam. Hello, I'm Tillman. I'm the CTO of Matrix. I've actually been with the company for over 5 years now, I think it is. I started as effectively a full stack developer back in the days when we were still 6 people, where basically everyone did everything. The company is a bit larger now, and unfortunately, our original founders retired end of last year, which gave me the opportunity to step in as the CTO. So I'm still fairly new. This is all very exciting, especially the administrative details of this job. But I've been around on Matrix for a while. I think I met a couple of our customers, at least online, before. Before Matrix, I worked in different roles always in software companies, from pre-sales to development to being a product owner in an agile process with multiple teams. So I've seen agile a lot from outside the regulated environment and then from the regulated perspective since I started with Matrix. So I have a fairly broad background there. I've also done Scrum Master and similar jobs. So yeah, I think I've seen most of the things that can happen in agile projects.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the intro. This is also Tillman's first webinar with us, so I'm very excited to go on this journey with Tillman. I think it's very interesting, the idea of an unregulated versus a regulated industry when we're thinking about Agile, when we're looking at how can teams be or implement these methodologies. I was going to say processes, but I've already been corrected several times that it's definitely not a process. So I suppose it's a good spot for us to start. Maybe, Tillman, you could elaborate on how agile methodologies, when they're applied to medical device development, are different just to software development in general.
Right. So I would actually argue that agile development, agile methodologies don't necessarily have to be very different in a regulated environment. What changes is effectively the deliverables of the agile iterations that you do. So typically in normal software development, which is, let's call it waterfall, which is associated also with regulated software development projects, there's this idea that you need to strictly design everything up front. You basically have to plan everything up front, then you go into the development phase, and then you can deliver your documentation better just because of the fact that nothing changed during the development process. So this whole idea of having a very rigid project workflow that removes variations and that makes it easier to document the end result. And even from my personal experience in Matrix, because we effectively also work in a regulated way, we're ISO certified. So we basically apply these same rules to us. What we found is that what changes is that we're more strict when it comes to the input to our development process. So we do try to at least have a good enough specification and architecture when we go into development, when we take something into development, which I've seen before. And for example, in terms of definition of ready in some cases in agile development teams where you basically try to do the same thing. You're trying to at least force a sufficient amount of specification before you start working on something, so you don't have too many questions and back and forth during the development cycle. And the same thing applies to the end result of these agile iterations where as part of the development process, you also create documentation, you also make sure that everything is tested. But this is actually not too uncommon for all kinds of agile methodologies. It just becomes a bit more stricter and actually more well-defined. You effectively have a larger definition of done, as it's often called. So you'll say that for something to be really done in an agile iteration, it needs documentation, it needs test coverage, and only then can you go to the next piece of work and basically to the next iteration. So I don't think it's that different. It turns this whole requirement that you have in a waterfall process and shortens it and applies the same thing, but in more iterations. And that actually makes it easier for the developers to also learn the process and for you to make sure that you actually produce everything that you need in the end to create the documentation. So it's actually beneficial to do this in an agile fashion where you can try it more often and refine it over time.
And I imagine that in the regulated environment, the amount of there's a lot more documentation that's required. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in non-regulated software development, you still try to produce things obviously like user documentation, but also some documentation about changes that you made to different versions of your software. But they're much less well defined. So it's more, it's typically marketing that will ask you for some release notes with a feature list. But that can be fairly fuzzy, while in a regulated environment, there's actually a very specific expectation to what you document. There's things like a risk analysis that you have to do that is much more detailed and much more clearly defined than it is in a non-regulated environment. Yes.
Okay, super clear. And so then the question is, I mean, how does the regulatory environment impact then the adoption of agile methodologies? Does it in medical device development?
I think in general it shouldn't. It probably, if you choose an agile framework and do it by the book, it might not do a few things or include a few things that you need to do in the regulated environment. But I think that's something that you can just add on. So if you, for example, take a Scrum process, as I mentioned, you have this idea of having a definition of done, so everyone knows what needs to be delivered at the end for something to be completed. And you just need to make sure that everything that you need for the regulatory process is included in that definition of done, so everyone understands what the deliverables are at the end of the project. And the other thing that might change is that if you're starting, you're probably getting an agile consultant in to help you with the workflows, who might not necessarily understand regulated processes. So in addition to that, you will need an RAQA person or regulatory consultant that takes this part and works together with the agile people to work out a process that works for both sides, for the project management side and also for the regulatory side.
And I mean, it's going a little bit off piste, but I guess that the idea that you now have to add a quality manager in the mix, it also impacts the way that your team collaborates, the way that your devs communicate, they're going backwards and forwards. Is there a big impact that you've seen within Matrix or within some of our customer companies where perhaps there is a big impact from having regulatory affairs people within the team that they need to collaborate with?
I think there can definitely be tensions if these teams are too isolated from each other. So if you have a development team that, let's say you have a development team that started on a purely non-regulated software project, and they realize that they're effectively building a SAMD, software as a medical device, and suddenly they are in a regulated environment, and then you just tack on an RAQA department that suddenly tells them what they have to do and what they need, without sufficient dialogue and also compromises in the processes, then you will have some tension there that's not helpful. But again, this is actually something that is quite typical for agile projects, where you try to mix in the QA teams with the development teams. So you try to have this multidisciplinary team setup so people can actually communicate the whole time during the development process, and don't turn this into something where you just throw the result over the fence and then let somebody else finish it. And in general, I think that's one of the most important lessons, is that you really make use of this idea of having these iterations, and use that to incrementally improve the process and include everyone to make sure that with every iteration, be it 1 month, 2 weeks, you reflect on what you did and what might be missing, and make sure you improve on that. So by the end of the whole process, everyone knows what needs to be done and you actually have everything ready, instead of tacking on 6 months of just doing documentation on a product that's already completed, which was effectively the worst case.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I suppose as well that that adds to an element of accountability, because the cycles are shorter, so the teams are more aware of what's going on, more aware of the changes, and it's not 6 months down the track and then we realize, oops, we forgot to think about our customer in that point, or in that specific feature that we're releasing. Okay. Super interesting. We do have a question already, which is great to see. Peter is asking if design verification is a part of each iteration. What do you have around that topic there, Tillman?
Um, I'm not sure I have a simple answer. So I would say it depends. When we go into development, at least what we do is that effectively the engineers verify the requirements and the specifications that they get and the product design. So yes, there's some aspect there. Um, Validation, verification, I guess depends on when you have a completed set or completed module or whatever you want to call it, or an increment that you can actually test. I mean, that would be ideal to break that down as well. Um, and the same, I would think, applies for risk analysis, which should be as early as possible. Um, so I hope that answers the question.
No, it's great. Well, Peter, feel free to add more to that. And we can come back to that at the end of the session as well. So as we move on to the next part, I guess it's important when there is a traditional or a waterfall methodology that's in place or a process that's in place. It's important to think of the steps that need to be put in place in order to transition from this more traditional outset to an agile development methodology. So what would be the first steps that you would advise that businesses start considering as they start to move to an agile development process?
Um, it depends a lot on how the company operates right now. If you have a very traditional company, let's say a company who's mostly been building hardware for the last 20 years and is just starting to get into software development in general and agile development specifically, I think the best idea is to really get a consultant in to help. This could also just be new hires that are already experienced, hires on the software side that help to build this up. Because I found that um, hardware companies, because of the way they operate, are very different from software companies, just in the general mindset. The other thing is that a lot about agile development is about changes in management. It would seem obvious that it's this affects mostly the software development part, but that's actually the easy bit because effectively, if you take any software developer these days, they'll probably be experienced in agile development practices and they'll gravitate towards that automatically. But there's a lot of things that you need to change in the product design phase and in the product planning phase to switch over to an agile development process. There's a lot less concrete planning that you can do. There's just an assumption that you spend less time on the design before you do the first increment, and then you always go back to the design phase. And this can be difficult for companies that have done very detailed planning for a long time and they kind of expect this to be the normal mode of operation. And what I found is this, you most typically see this in the planning when you get to the point where effectively the software team says, no, we can't do scoping for the next 2 years. We don't know how long something is going to take. And getting into that discussion with people that have been used to planning 2-3 years in advance because they've been building products where you just can't switch around that quickly anymore. So I think that's the part where you probably need to see first if you're ready for that and then start it with small projects. Like if you're building a software library for a hardware product where you're just extending it, then that's probably a good thing to start with to practice the whole approach. And I probably wouldn't jump into a 3-year project without any agile experience and just say, okay, we do this agile now, but you know, we're going to have a big business plan for the next 3 years ready. So that's not going to work. The other thing is that I found really useful is just do retrospectives. Like once you start trying to implement these cycles, the typical agile iterations that you do, and the minimum viable products, etc. Really do retrospectives every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, where everyone involved gets together and you just have a discussion about what is going well and what might need to change. Because agile processes are different for every company, for every team. And I think it's totally valid to start with something, maybe just take Scrum because it's fairly common, but then see how it works for everyone and don't try to stay pure Scrum just because that's what you had in the training. Instead, try to see if it works for you, if it works for your teams, do adjustments and really learn over time. And even after 3 years, you'll probably still find things that don't work as well as they should, and you still need to make adjustments there. I think that's very important.
Super clear. I mean, it leads me on to my next topic, which is more around the compliance element and making sure that we can sort of ensure compliance. Many of the customers here at Matrix Requirements are in a pre-market phase, so they haven't launched their medical device to market yet, or they're looking at different markets. So maybe they're going to in Europe and they're going under the MDR, or they're going over to the US and they're looking at FDA. How can teams ensure compliance with regulatory standards whilst also at the same time adopting this agile approach?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I like the long pause.
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer. I think you can try again to make sure that you review your processes and your documentation and your whole risk analysis process regularly with your RAQA department, and you adjust as quickly as possible when you see that there are gaps. My experience, the most important thing is to not do this at the end, to really include your internal department if they're experienced, or get somebody external in to look at what you're doing. And also start with the documentation really early, even if it's mostly empty. Find out what you will need for submission and start filling that up. And as soon as you build the first part of your product, make sure that's sufficiently documented and validate that just for that little part, the documentation would actually be complete, because that way you can make sure that you're not forgetting something that you then have to catch up on at the end of the process.
I think the main thing that I've heard many of our customers talk about is just being prepared, thinking about things in advance and making sure that when we're implementing a new feature, that we're already, before it's even, or whilst it's at its conception, we're already thinking about the documentation that goes with it so that everything is aligned. Otherwise, I think it's can be very frustrating for both regulatory and dev teams or engineers. So I guess on that point, I mean, how do you avoid the more, how can we get engineers who are used to this agile approach into a more structured environment where they are prepared without them getting frustrated? I mean, as you mentioned, there are a lot of them are sort of in there, they already know how to do it. They've been doing it this way for a long time, and it can cause some tension. So what are your suggestions on how to reduce that friction?
So I'm just going to speak about how we do it. I think it depends a lot on the team and the individuals and team dynamics. But generally, on our side, what we try to do is educate everyone on why we need to provide documentation way beyond what you would normally do in an agile process, and show how this is actually being used. So the important thing is like show them what we have to hand in for every release that we do, show them how what they need to provide plays into this, and just make it clear that this is effectively a team effort. That's something that can't be done by somebody at the end of the process, and they won't be involved. And I think once you get there, and once you do it in a rational fashion, that they can understand that what they're doing is what's necessary and not something that somebody came up with just for the heck of it. That it's not just bureaucracy. Then if you have a team who really wants to release a regulated product, I think everyone will do the work. It's just like if you make testing an integral part of software development. There might be developers who don't like testing, but if everyone does it, if it's just part of the process and it makes sense because the product is more stable, then everyone will write tests and everyone will execute tests. And I think there's a big part here which is about educating everyone so everyone has an understanding what you're actually doing this for.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think it's understanding the gravity of the situation, especially within medical devices, this industry. I mean, it has to be priority number one because we can't launch the product to market at all. It's also very closely linked, I think, to company culture, not only on the engineer side, but everywhere within the business, that the understanding what do these regulations mean to us and how, if we don't abide by that documentation or we don't have the correct documentation in place, we won't be able to launch it to market. So those are really, really important points, which are very closely linked to company culture as well. So jumping, or we'll make a slight pivot, just being aware of the time. I suppose it's good for us to think about the tools and the technology that is essential for supporting agile development practices. What would you see as sort of the essential tools that engineering teams should be thinking about now to ensure that they're not going to be looking back in 6 months and say, I wish I had something in place that had helped me because now, there's too much friction between our teams?
Well, the CTO at Matrix, I would definitely recommend our tool
It's not a
for the
marketing push, I
documentation.
promise.
No, but generally speaking, I mean, on the Agile side, there's lots of different tools you can use for backlog management, for project management. The most common one, obviously, being Jira, but depending on the complexity of the process, you can just use GitHub or GitLab or any kind of Kanban board if you want to. This is the one thing, and I think everyone doing software development is probably comfortable with that, and it will have their preference. I think where Matrix and similar tools come in is managing the other side of that, which is to mean the requirements, the specifications, the design, but also risks, mitigations, all of these things that project management tools are not built for. I think it's also important to pick a requirements management tool that is flexible enough that it can reflect different structures that you might need for different regulations, and that also give you a bit of flexibility in managing variations in those regulatory frameworks. I mean, one of the core features that Matrix has that is very non-typical for other tools that might be used for plain project management is that it actually generates documentation for you that you can hand in based on different types of queries and selectors and everything around that. So it's an important tool to, on the one hand, still be flexible with changes in the project, being able to track those changes and being able to track relationships and traceability between items in those projects, and still give you good enough documentation that you can hand in that is consistent and that you can also track between versions of your product. So I think that's very important, and that was, to me, coming from purely agile development, was probably the biggest change, understanding that there's another part there where you actually have to produce consistent documentation. Also, test management, obviously, once you get into the verification phase, to make sure that everything is covered by test cases for every release. There's also millions of tools for this that you'll just have to pick based on your personal preferences. Matrix does that as well, but in a very specific way. There are other tools that might be more automated, etc. So, but I think that's the most important bit for all of these, is that you can track all of this information in a way that things are linked together. So at the end of the project, you can always do a consistency check and see, have I covered everything? Because if you do change things up a lot, it's easy to lose track. And if you use something just like a Word document with links, then you'll probably have something at the end where it becomes very hard to find out if you actually stayed consistent, even though you made a lot of changes. And that's just in the nature of switching to an agile process, where during the process, you're going to make a lot of changes to improve the product.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've been here at Matrix for over a year, and I think the one thing that I've heard the most is traceable documentation, making sure that we can see it from conception to delivery, right from the beginning to the end. It eliminates those headaches that start from not having the right documentation in place and the right tools. We've got Diana, who's asked a question, which is she's already a customer, which is awesome. Great to have you here, Diana. And she's asking if we have templates for SAMD that can be incorporated into projects.
Yes, we have a template for SXMD more generically. Since I'm not the regulatory specialist, I would recommend you just talk to your sales contact, and they can probably give you a presentation or give you information about that.
We can make sure as well, Diana, that after this this session that we send across the information on the SXMD templates. We have a couple of videos that explain how they work and what they do. So I'll make sure to send that over to you. Well, moving on to the final leg of this session now is really looking at the future. How we see Agile methodologies evolving over the next 5 to 10 years. Do we see specific things that we should be aware of now? What are your thoughts around that, Tillman? I'll just share my screen once again as we jump into.
Yeah, I think there was also a question we didn't answer yet.
There may be one. We can come back to it just after this slide.
Okay.
There we go. So just looking at the future trends of Agile, I've noted down a couple of things here around cybersecurity, more releases, regulation efficiencies, and more feedback loops. What are your thoughts around those, Tillman?
Well, generally speaking, I think software will become even more important. I mean, SAMD, basically considering software as a medical device in the first place, but also a lot of software components in hardware medical devices. This will only grow. The complexity will grow as the applications become more complex. So I think that's just a general trend in software. And I think on the medical side, it might be slightly delayed, but it's still going to affect medical the same way. And to me, the main reason for agile development in the first place is just this complexity, where you have to integrate more and more external components that are already complex in themselves. One very popular case right now is AI, where you're effectively using software components that in themselves are very hard to lock down. So having a way to iterate and test often and then tweak the results becomes more and more important because it's very hard upfront to say, okay, I'm going to put in this component, it's going to behave this way, and we just need to do one test cycle and we're done. That's just not going to be the case anymore. So generally speaking, everything will need a lot more iterations, a lot more fine tuning to get to a point where it's reliable. Same for cybersecurity, with devices becoming more connected. Secure systems, you can plan for them by having good architecture, but in the end, you will always have to test them thoroughly. And when you test them, you will find problems. So again, there's lots of iterations you'll have to do. And a big part of that is going to be regular updates of software. So you can't rely on the fact that you're going to ship something that is just going to be secure. You'll probably have to have a process in place where you can provide updates very quickly, which again means iterating quite a bit and regularly on your software.
Sure. For sure. The topic of AI, we've covered that quite a lot here at Matrix Requirements as well. We have quite a few customers that have AI, and actually we have an AI Act series because the AI Act has recently been approved in Europe, so there's going to be some significant impacts on medical device companies with AI. So if that is you and you're here today, please feel free also to take a look at our AI Act guide. There's quite a few blog posts on that topic, as well as several webinars where we're actually speaking with those that have helped to write the AI Act as part of the European Commission. So I will also make sure that that comes in our follow-up post-webinar. That leads us to the end of today's session. What I would love to do, though, is just see if we've got any questions that we haven't answered right now, and maybe we can answer these for you. So we have somebody who's asked about whether we can have some hints on when and how risk assessment should be implemented in medical device development. Maybe we can start with that first question, then we can jump to their second question following that. Do you have some hints on that, Tillman?
Well, risk assessment as early as possible. I would say as soon as you design any part of your system, and I'm speaking as a software developer, not a hardware developer, so keep that in mind. Like making an architectural choice, for example, networking would be, I think, a good example. If you decide, okay, for this feature, I want to put some service in there that has network connectivity, then you should probably immediately do a risk assessment of that and also define mitigations that need to be implemented as part of that as quickly as possible, because it's very hard to change things later on. You might need to make a lot more changes if you do this later on. For the kappas, the way I understand kappas is more for released products. So I think if there is a known issue, or if there's a discovered issue, then that should come into the Agile process. We usually do this as effectively a bug or a task that needs to be done. We pick it up as quickly as possible and make sure we implement it for the corrective action for the next iteration. That's at least how we do it. So again, as early as possible, because that's probably something where the product needs to be stabilized.
Okay, awesome. And then just one final question that we have from Joseph, which is, do we see Agile for medical device firmware evolving in the same direction as Agile for software as a medical device?
So fortunately, I never had to write any firmware code. I'm very glad about that. But generally, from what I've seen, the trend is probably towards more standard libraries or external libraries, even for embedded or firmware code. And I think as soon as you start having a lot of external dependencies that also need to be updated, Um, I think Agile in general makes a lot of sense because it gives you more opportunities to do these updates and to also do verification on them. If if all the code is self-written and you know exactly what you're trying to do and it's fairly low in complexity in terms of dependencies, then maybe agility is not that important because you know typically if you have an engineer who's been writing or maintaining that code base for 5 years and you ask him to make a change, then he probably has a very good idea of what he needs to do, how long it's going to take, and where the risks are. But if you're getting into a place where a lot of the things you do actually are provided from the outside and you're not really sure about the quality of that, then you probably want to have an iterative process where you can do as much testing and as much adjustment as possible. So I think, yes, it's probably going to be more relevant there as well.
Well, that leads us to the end of today's session with Tillman, our CTO here at Matrix Requirements, and I'm Adam, Head of Marketing here at Matrix Requirements. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to join us on this discussion. We're always open to new topics and questions, so please don't hesitate to reach out to Tillman or myself following this session if there are things that we maybe haven't answered or that we could answer to help you on your journey to compliance and also on your journey to building out agile teams and the right method, implementing the right methodology within your organization. And join us for our next session, which we'll be having our next webinar in April, where we'll be focusing on high-risk AI. So if you are a medical device company with AI, don't hesitate to join that webinar. And thanks so much. We'll speak to you all soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.